I'm sure you folks will remember that Rich Adler joined us for the first time as a speaker let's see, in February of 2023, about a year ago. And he spoke about decision making by means of what he describes as test drives. In other words, to like you do with an automobile, to take it out and see how it runs and see whether it makes sense for you to buy it and so on and so forth. And he came back with us today to give us a little bit of an update and some demonstrations of just exactly what that means in a practical sense. So, Rich, I'm just delighted to have you rejoin the Wilson Forum again today, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me back for a follow-on presentation and discussion of our decision support work. It's not directly related to the energy topics you normally talk about, but given that behind the scenes there are decisions going on that dictate what happens, I think it's sort of important to think about how do we make better decisions. So, in my talk last year, I described a method for improving critical decisions by organizations. As you pointed out, this method was inspired by the familiar process of test driving cars. So basically, a test drive lets you assess the performance and comfort of cars before you actually sit down and buy one. You simply try out the cars of interest on different types of roads and compare your experiences. Similarly, you can test drive decisions by simulating them and comparing their projected outcomes across a range of possible future conditions. So both exercises offer valuable insights into what it would be like to live with the consequences of your choices and helps you avoid surprises and disappointments. I illustrated this method using an example decision for managing critical risks. Our test drive model simulated the rollout of alternative sets of security measures to counter terrorist threats to the nation's highways. By projecting and comparing outcomes in terms of risk reduced, total cost, and ROI, or return on investment, the test drive model helped TSA improve its counterterrorism strategy. Examples of critical decisions include strategy and policy, transactions like mergers and going public, and major operational initiatives such as downsizing, hiring key executives, and switching core business processes. So what makes decisions critical? Well, first, they entail significant risk, not only to the organization, but to the careers of decision makers. They impact diverse stakeholders such as customers, investors, employees, and competitors. They play out over months, years, or even decades, rather than weeks or hours. And their impacts extend beyond the organization into markets, the economy, and the society at large. So these characteristics complicate organizational decision-making in several important ways. They give rise to complex objectives measured with multiple metrics that often conflict. So that leads to difficult trade-offs. They feature many moving parts and constraints. So this makes it challenging to allocate resources and schedule the implementation of interrelated activities. Doing nothing is not a safe fallback or default, which is to say that staying the course is at least as risky as responding proactively. They're not conducive to optimal or what they call closed-end solutions using things like predictive analytics, operations research, or even the mighty machine learning these days. And their extended duration means that leaders must monitor critical decisions closely while they're being executed and be prepared to modify decisions as their environments evolve over time. And finally, to add insult to injury, critical decisions occur with relatively low frequency, making it hard for most organizations to build and maintain internal expertise. So in my previous talk, I asserted that critical decisions go awry because of the law of unintended consequences, stated here. I also argued that two causal factors power the law: cognitive biases and bounded rationality. So recall that biases stem from the instincts and intuitions that enable us to size up and respond to unfamiliar people and situations quickly, despite having minimal data. Unfortunately, these mental reflexes tend to be misleading and unreliable in complex situations and over extended time horizons, which leads to flawed judgments and unexpected outcomes. Bounded rationality refers to the fact that human beings have finite resources for making critical decisions. And these constraints include incomplete data on the situation at hand, imperfect scientific knowledge, innate limits in our cognitive capabilities, and fixed time and resource budgets for making decisions. Throw in human fallibility, and one might wonder why many more critical decisions don't go off the rails. So on this analysis, the law of unintended consequences is congenital. As such, it can't be avoided or broken. However, I argue in my book that the law's unpleasant effects can be reduced in both frequency and severity. This bending, as I call it, requires activities designed to blunt the law's two causes. First, we can defend against cognitive biases by applying disciplined thinking to override wayward intuitions. For example, we can pause and think things through rather than blindly following our gut instincts. Deliberate analysis reduces the likelihood of avoidably bad outcomes. However, bending the law significantly requires a second effort, namely improving decision quality to ensure superior outcomes. Bounded rationality precludes predicting the future reliably. However, it doesn't prevent us from anticipating plausible futures more effectively, nor does it prevent us from exploring the possible consequences of decisions in those futures more thoroughly. So the bottom line is that better anticipation means fewer unintended consequences because it exposes possible threats early, enabling you to take steps to avoid or mitigate them. The decision test drive method was designed to support and coordinate both activities. So our diagnosis of why critical decisions fail suggested a treatment for this ailment, namely bending the law. Today I'm going to justify why the decision test drive method is the best approach to realizing this bending strategy by presenting a design rationale for our method. So to start, consider a best practices process for making critical decisions. I've highlighted the key steps for our purpose. Decision framing focuses on articulating what you want your decision to accomplish. Framing consists of several underappreciated tasks that you need to do up front. Formulating explicit goals and objectives, identifying important values to constrain what makes a decision option acceptable, defining in advance the metrics for judging a decision's success or failure, and establishing preferences to guide trade-offs among competing objectives and values. The values may be moral, legal, business, or technical. For example, a decision shouldn't violate environmental regulations or lead to financial losses that exceed some threshold. Decision framing is much like prep work for home repair projects such as painting a room. You need to scrape, patch holes, tape the trim, and sand and wash the walls before you apply the paint. If you don't thoroughly prepare, your paint job will look rotten and it won't hold up over time. By analogy, deficient decision framing leads to problems such as failing to address unarticulated needs, wasting resources on unimportant wants, considering only options that are obvious, and selecting metrics that align poorly with organizational success. The other steps I've highlighted focus on developing and evaluating alternatives and then selecting one to execute. Given that better anticipation is the key to bending the law, it's crucial that decision options reflect how your environment is likely to evolve while you're executing them. Thus, to formulate viable options, you must first project the future. Moreover, evaluating options presupposes that you project their outcomes. Otherwise, you're left with limited grounds for comparing them. So framing informs all three steps: option formulation, analysis, and selection. In academic circles, the analytic techniques that support the decision-making process are collectively labeled decision science. Here are some prominent tools that support the crucial process steps I just highlighted. The leading methods for framing decisions are value-focused thinking and analytical hierarchy process, or AHP. Value-focused thinking leverages utility theory, or its close cousin, prospect theory, to quantify decision-maker preferences among performance metrics. For example, do you favor increasing market share over profit, and to what degree? So utility theory enables consistent and quantifiable trade-offs across expected outcomes for decision options, a very useful tool. It also helps you analyze preferences for other decision stakeholders for outcomes, which helps you anticipate their likely behaviors. Now, futures can be projected in various ways. Scenario planning, which I'll describe shortly, offers a qualitative technique. Predictive analytics includes probabilistic methods such as Bayesian inference and statistical techniques such as regression analysis and machine learning. Predictive methods are quantitative, but they're static. That is, they forecast events or conditions at a specific future time. By contrast, simulations project over evolving futures and decision outcomes continuously over extended intervals. This enables you to assess decisions not simply based on their end states, but also based on what happened along the way. Formulating options for critical decisions requires knowledge specific to a particular decision and domain of interest. This can encompass the physical sciences and engineering, social sciences, law, public policy, management theory, and strategy. Developing credible options, unfortunately, is often more of an art than a science. Projecting outcomes is a special case of projecting futures, extrapolating how decision options are likely to turn out in the context of evolving environments. For critical decisions, this requires accounting for the fact that your organization's stakeholders often modify their decisions and behaviors while you're executing yours, where those actions may invalidate the assumptions that grounded your initial decision. Evaluating options hinges on making trade-offs based on the relative performance of decision options against goals and objectives. Comparative analytic tools expedite comparisons by summarizing values of key metrics across options using graphical plots and tables. The decision test drive method synthesizes two of the techniques just surveyed, scenario planning and simulation. It folds in the other tools as needed. So some of you might be familiar with scenario planning. The technique was developed by Herman Kahn, a defense analyst at the Rand Corporation in the late 1940s. Kahn created this method to help explore nuclear strategies in the Cold War, other than total annihilation or abject surrender. His scenarios drove the creation of a novel deterrence-based strategy for the U.S. and its allies called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD. Spoiler alert, it worked, and somehow we're still here. Kahn's method was commercialized by Royal Dutch Shell, who applied it to envision possible futures to inform their energy investment strategies. Not coincidentally, like strategic defense, energy strategies are long-term, costly, and high-risk bets. So it was an easy decision to try and apply the method. The Shell team's most notable success was to develop a scenario anticipating the emergence of an oil cartel. Forewarned, Shell modified its strategy and was able to respond more effectively than its competitors when the Arab states formed OPEC in 1960. Several alumni from the Shell team left over time to create boutique consultancies. A handful of practitioners remain active today, but scenario planning was never widely adopted. Why not? Well, organizations must generally hire outside consultants with specialized expertise in building scenarios. This process is poorly automated, time-consuming, costly, and arduous. The resulting stories depict a handful of possible futures from a coarse-grained 50,000-foot perspective. They provide broad snapshots of entire markets or societies, but only a few select parties, such as major governments and dominant corporations, appear explicitly in those stories. Moreover, the dynamics for scenarios are highly schematic and qualitative. Basically, scenarios represent the short preambles used to set context for science fiction movies. Remember the scrolling text in the first Star Wars movie. While vivid, these stories are vague as to how a scenario comes about and its concrete details. To be sure, scenario planning often produces valuable insights, largely because it forces organizations to focus intently on thinking about the future. But in practice, the process is largely decoupled from critical decision-making itself. Instead, scenarios tend to be thrown over the wall, as it were, to the strategists, who use them to test and validate their pre-existing decision options rather than spurring the creation of novel ones. Scenario planning's fundamental drawback is that it's not really directly actionable. True, it offers insights into what the world could look like in the future. However, this doesn't really scratch the fundamental itch for executive decision makers, which is to understand what will become of us if we do X in that future. After all, it's very hard to explore your decision options if you and your key stakeholders don't even appear in scenarios. This would be like navigating a downtown using a kiosk street map with no "You Are Here" marker, and which leaves out some of the streets and buildings. Moreover, scenario planning provides no tools for capturing decision options, much less projecting their outcomes. Finally, scenario planning is so effortful and costly that organizations rarely elect to revisit and update scenarios years later. Computer-based simulations enable dramatic increases in automation and the scale of decision models compared to the brief narrative stories and diagrams used to capture analog scenarios. Digital models allow markets or societies to be represented at nearly arbitrary levels of detail. Better still, they accommodate the inclusion of your organization and all relevant stakeholders into the decision models, specifying, maintaining, and updating all desired properties and relationships that you can browse through. So rather than hand-waving about the influence of situational forces and trends producing some end-state future, simulations provide concrete dynamics for projecting futures quantitatively. One major drawback, however, is that simulations focus narrowly on one step of the decision-making process, namely the evaluation options step. And as such, they offer little, if any, support to the other important phases. Now, decision test drives combine the benefits of scenario planning and simulation while avoiding their respective weaknesses. So test drives leverage scenario planning to determine what should be simulated. That is, which sets of what-if assumptions to use when projecting decision outcomes. Equally important, test drives exploit computer-based decision models to extend and essentially personalize traditional scenarios. Scaling model size and detail digitally solves the "You Are Here" problem. This also makes it possible to incorporate your decision options and plausible responses by stakeholders. Thus, test drive simulations can project what leaders really want to know, namely, what are the consequences of their decision options in complex evolving environments. And, as discussed in my last talk, the test drive method features best practices templates tailored to model specific types of critical decisions. These reusable templates reduce the expertise, cost, and effort required to develop custom scenarios tailored to decisions of that type facing individual organizations. Test drives also allow you to reproject your chosen decisions as you execute them over time, allowing you to revalidate and adjust them if needed. So in short, by integrating multiple decision support techniques and increasing automation, the test drive method bends the law dramatically and promotes broader usage in the bargain. Given this design rationale, it's time to revisit the test drive process itself, which I reviewed last time. So recall, we start with a baseline description of your current situation, including your decision environment, the state of your organization, and other stakeholders. The baseline also incorporates the performance metrics for comparing projected outcomes of decision options. Next, we replicate this baseline scenario and extend each such copy, with what-if assumptions about market, social, and government influences that define a distinct, plausible future. So this step is where traditional scenario planning contributes to decision test drives. Next, we define a set of alternative decisions to consider in sufficient detail to allow simulating their execution. So a decision option is generally modeled as a schedule for the activities required to implement it, along with estimates of how each such activity will move the dial on performance metrics and how costs will accrue over each time interval to do it. Now copy each of the plausible futures, inserting one alternative decision into each one. I call the resulting variant models dynamic scenarios to distinguish them from traditional ones. Each such model amounts to a script for a movie of one decision option and one plausible future. Now project the outcomes of these dynamic scenarios using the test drive simulation engine. Finally, evaluate the projected outcomes using comparative analytics on the metrics designed during decision framing and apply a rule to select the best decision. The goal of a test drive is to identify the decision option that produces the most attractive outcomes across a broad range of plausible futures while avoiding any train wrecks. In this case, it's decision B. This decision will likely be suboptimal in formal economic terms. However, it will be robust in the face of uncertainty and thereby minimize exposure to the law. By contrast, competing methods seek to identify the best performing decision, assuming the most likely future obtains. Given bounded rationality, this is unnecessarily risky. And this is a key point. Test drives equate the best decision with the most robust one, not one that is optimal in one future, however probable it may be. So I've now explained the why and the what of the test drive method. The why, or design rationale, derives from two requirements: helping leaders anticipate the future more effectively and supporting multiple steps in the critical decision-making process. The what specified the process or recipe for conducting test drives, which I just showed you. It remains to discuss briefly the how, namely, how does the test drive method simulate situational dynamics in a realistic manner? So critical decisions are analogous to plotting a course across a river or lake. A sailor is unlikely to reach his or her intended destination unless they account for the prevailing winds and currents. Similarly, bending the law requires you to anticipate what's likely to happen in your environment while you execute a critical decision. This is particularly important for decision environments that are prone to diverge from historical behavior patterns or where nonlinear influences are at work, which is precisely where the competing techniques tend to break down. So what types of situational dynamics shape the outcome of critical decisions? Think of this taxonomy as a set of building blocks for test drive simulations. Examples of events include an increase in product prices or a new regulation that takes effect on a specified date. More broadly, an event is a one-time change or set of changes in parameters used to model a decision environment. A trend is simply a rate of change in some feature of the situation. Trends are either constant or they only change infrequently. Examples that are familiar include the annual rate of inflation for an economy or the annual rate of growth for a population. A force is an influence that changes irregularly over time, such as the level of societal support for public policy or the rate of technology innovation. Forces have a magnitude or intensity and effects. Effects change the value of parameters as functions of the force's intensity. For example, when technology innovation intensifies, it drives the rate of new product introductions to increase, although possibly with a time lag. Note that forces may change magnitudes one time, generally caused by an event, or continuously, ramping up or down over an extended period. A process consists of a script or recipe for a sequence of activities that are carried out repeatedly. For example, major companies follow standardized processes for developing new products or carrying out mergers and acquisitions. Organizations and their stakeholders are intentional. They formulate and pursue goals and objectives on their own while you're doing your own thing. Intentionality makes stakeholders adaptive. They sense and respond. That is, they monitor their environments for material changes and adjust their behaviors accordingly to better achieve their desired ends. Adaptations often involve changing tactics, but can escalate to revising objectives and even goals. To bend the law, you must try to anticipate reactions of all relevant intentional parties and their impacts on decision outcomes. Decision makers find it easy to identify their most adaptive stakeholders, such as competitors or terrorist adversaries. However, I've learned through bitter experience that leaders resist or even refuse to think through exactly how those stakeholders might adapt, much less to consider how to modify decision options to counter those adaptations in advance. It's very hard to do that psychologically. Incomplete and uncertain data, I'm sure we're all familiar with. They're ubiquitous in critical decisions. Exact values for many situational parameters are frequently unknown, such as the marketing budget of competitors or the future value of a market index. Fortunately, a rich set of statistical and inferential methods have been developed to estimate these values, depending on what types of information are available. Population fluxes are existential changes that involve the birth, combination, or death of things. That is, they change the number of members of a market or society. For example, new products are introduced over time, while old ones are pulled from markets. Even more complicated, businesses don't simply get created or closed down, that is, get born or die. They often merge or are acquired. So in contrast to population fluxes, trends only change properties of entities that maintain their identity over time. Population fluxes are often ignored in decision analyses because it's difficult to model and simulate changing casts of characters. Network dynamics consist of a special kind of population flux, in which not only individual entities are created or disappear, but also relationships or links between them. Now, you might think this is esoteric, but in fact, network dynamics are required to project and understand the behaviors of things like supply chains, computer networks, and social media. Other dynamics sometimes appear in critical decisions. One example is a technique called real options, which is basically a special type of decision process for breaking up large projects or investments into stages rather than all or none choices. Venture capitalists and drug companies favor real options because they offer the flexibility to take actions or make investments incrementally based on performance milestones along the way. So my purpose in reviewing this rather extensive taxonomy is not to drown you in details, but to try and convey the remarkable diversity of sources for change in our world. So the key takeaway is that the law of unintended consequences derives its breadth and power from these dynamics taken collectively. Some or all of them are going to occur in your decision. And leaders who fail to appreciate the potential impact of these influences on critical decisions are likely to receive a rude awakening. So fortunately, decision sciences offer a rich assortment for modeling and simulating these diverse real-world dynamics. Time doesn't permit a detailed review, but the techniques listed in the second column of this table constitute the usual suspects. What's important for present purposes is how decision test drives relate to this cornucopia of methods. I often liken most simulationists to jihadists. They tend to adopt one simulation paradigm for modeling any decision they encounter, adhering to their chosen method with near religious fervor. As Maslow famously noted, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. By contrast, our approach to designing simulations for test driving decisions is more akin to polytheism. We view all of these established simulation paradigms as valuable and useful. However, each one was designed and tailored to model a particular dynamic. As such, these techniques are less adept or useful at handling dynamics for which they were not designed. Consider, for example, how hammers, screwdrivers, and soldering irons perform when used to drive nails, turn screws, and connect wires. Try using a hammer, for example, to create a reliable electrical connection. It's not a pretty sight. The tradespeople typically encounter diverse construction or repair tasks in their daily work. Rather than bringing a single tool to a project, they bring a collection, which allows them to select the best tool or tools most suited to the next task at hand. Similarly, critical decisions generally embody multiple dynamics driving the evolution of situations and decision outcomes. And those dynamics often interact with one another. Thus, the solitary simulation tool as hammer needs to be replaced by a toolbox. And our test drive framework enables the selection, use, and interaction between tools that best capture the situational dynamics dominating the critical decision du jour. So much for the theory of test drives. I'm now going to illustrate how these decision support concepts come together in practice. Our example decision test drive this time focuses on competitive marketing strategies in the pharmaceutical industry. The decision makers in this domain are marketing executives called brand managers. A drug marketing strategy consists of two component decisions: pricing, which simply determines how much to charge for a drug prescription, including planned increases in the future, and marketing mix, which dictates how to allocate company resources for marketing and selling a prescription drug over time. Marketing mix strategies are challenging for several reasons. First, the amount of money involved in these decisions is absolutely staggering. It currently costs upwards of $2 billion on average to develop and obtain FDA approval for a new branded drug, which allows it to be brought to market in the U.S. What's even more amazing is that large drug companies frequently spend an equal, if not greater, amount of money to market and sell branded drugs over their life cycles. Marketing mix decisions are complicated, both organizationally and analytically. In the U.S., marketing and sales resources must be allocated across three distinct categories or channels: detailing and sampling, which consists of sales reps visiting physicians to supply information and free samples and develop relationships; direct-to-consumer advertising, or DTC ads, the bane of our existence because they're ubiquitous across TV, radio, print, and social media; and finally, discounts to payers, rebates to insurers, pharmacy benefits managers, and government payment agencies such as Medicare to induce them to include drugs in their formularies. And if you're not in a formulary, the insurer won't cover your payment. All three channels are in flux. The effectiveness of detailing is declining because physicians have little, if any, time and attention for sales calls. Consumer involvement in their own healthcare is increasing, but the returns on DTC ads is unclear. In particular, what's the amount of influence that consumers actually assert on their doctor's prescribing behavior? Finally, soaring costs are driving increasing interventions by government, payers, insurers, and businesses to reduce prices. Third, few analytic tools are available to support marketing mix decisions. This stands in stark contrast with diverse techniques for pricing drugs, for optimizing investment decisions, and optimizing drug discovery and development processes. Finally, the dynamic elephant in the brand manager's room is anticipating responses by competitors to market changes. More on this problem shortly. One last piece of context is worth noting. Market intelligence for the pharmaceutical industry is extensive. Everybody has access to information from numerous third-party providers who track the behaviors of prescribers and consumers. They also compile data on drug producers, including market share, pricing, estimated sales force sizes, and estimated ad budgets for medical journals. Moreover, most large drug companies maintain proprietary market intelligence on competitor responses to changing situations across different drug markets over time. So we developed a decision test drive called Compete RX in partnership with SDG, a local consultancy with expertise in the pharma sector. They asked us to focus on competitive marketing decisions because none of their competitors had tools to support these high-risk strategies. In describing Compete RX, I'll follow the order in which I presented the key test drive concepts earlier on, starting with framing. Compete RX employs 4 familiar financial metrics to measure performance of decision outcomes. The percentage of market share gained for the drug of interest, net sales, net profits, and net present value, which simply measures, this is NPV, which measures profitability over time on projects or investments. NPV is computed by summing up annual net cash flows, which is simply revenues minus costs, and adjusting them to present value using a discount rate. It's kind of the opposite of inflation. In essence, NPV is a measure of ROI. So the goals and objectives for marketing strategies are formulated using these performance metrics. Examples include maintaining or improving market share, increasing profits, etc. Now, like goals and objectives, a brand manager's relative preferences for these metrics depends on context, including the drug market of interest, the brand manager's company, and the product's history and position in the market. For example, new entrants are unlikely to excel on any of these metrics, while brand managers for established products commonly focus on maintaining or improving market share and profits. In mature companies with multiple drugs, brand managers compete for resources from a fixed corporate marketing budget. In this zero-sum game, brand managers and their superiors emphasize NPV most heavily because it's an investment-oriented metric. A common value applied to constrained decision options is don't break any laws or violate SEC or FDA regulations. Note that the current model for CompeteRx doesn't treat company values explicitly. So a big part of the middle of my talk was on situational dynamics. What situational dynamics drive the behavior of drug markets and shape the outcome of drug marketing strategy? I'll use 3 categories defined in my last talk to organize salient drug market dynamics. A brand manager's behavior consists of the marketing mix and pricing strategies for their drug, along with any corporate marketing policies and practices of his or her drug company. Stakeholder behaviors in CompeteRx consist of corresponding marketing strategies for all companies with products competing in the target drug market. These are rarely public, so they must be inferred from business intelligence. The third category consists of changes in environmental conditions that will or could occur during the life cycle of the brand manager's decision. So in test drive parlance, these are the things that delineate the plausible possible futures. Drug markets experience diverse kinds of changes, including the following. Trends and events in the economy impact drug markets. Examples include annual rate of growth and inflation. Common events include supply chain disruptions and global increases in prices of production equipment and drug ingredients. There are some trends that are specific to drug markets. A prominent demographic example is the annual rate of growth or shrinkage in patient population. Here are some common examples of events. Entry of a new FDA-approved branded drug by a competitor, patent expiry for a branded drug in the market. So drug patents last for 20 years after the invention, but the approval process can easily consume half of that period, so it might be as short as 10 years. Patent expiry typically triggers the rapid entrance of generic versions of the drug into the market at lower price points, which erodes market share and price supports for the remaining branded drugs. The company whose drug patent expired may produce their own generic or exit the market but license their product to contract manufacturers to sell. Alternatively, they may introduce a replacement branded drug based on different technologies or incremental improvements that are sufficient to warrant new patents. This is a common strategy. Other potentially seismic events include changes in payer reimbursement, FDA mandated changes in user profiles and drug labeling based on new clinical data, or FDA policy changes for drug ads. So there's a lot of things that go on in the drug market. Many of these factors are telegraphed well in advance in corporate financial reports, patents, public filings with the FDA, or FDA notices. So brand managers have no excuse for not anticipating them. So how does CompeteRx capture these rich market dynamics to conduct realistic decision test drives? So our behavioral model contains three primary pieces: two to capture dynamics in the drug market, and one to depict marketing strategies for individual drugs. Market growth refers to the rate of change in the size of the target patient population in the U.S. It derives from two demographic trends: the annual rate of growth for the prevalent patient population, that is, people with the relevant medical conditions for that drug, and the annual rate of penetration, that is, the percentage of the prevalent population who have prescriptions for drug in that market. The relative shares for the drugs in a given market at a point in time are determined by a predictive statistical model. We adapted a multivariate regression equation developed by researchers at the MIT Sloan School. This model predicts how the drug market pizza is divided into slices for each participating prescription drug. The dependent variables for the regression are order of market entry, time on market, price per prescription, number of adverse side effects, marketing mix, and marketing stock. Now, marketing stock is a proxy parameter for the drug's brand value, which reflects things like market recognition, reputation, and trust. Essentially, the stock price increases with repeated exposure to ads by physicians and patients. That's driven by marketing mix. And it declines once ads cease and recognition fades. The coefficients for these regression parameters must be calculated using historical data for each drug market of interest. Most of this data is publicly available, except for marketing mix and stock, which can be estimated from third-party market intel. CompeteRx captures two types of events that exemplify what I call population fluxes in drug markets: patent expiry and the entry of new FDA-approved drugs. Recall that fluxes are existential changes that alter population sizes. In this case, drugs whose patents expire are removed from the market, while new drugs expand the set of competing products. An interesting fact, though, is if a drug company that produces such drugs has no other products in the given market, that company must be added to or removed from the market as appropriate. So there's two types of entities involved here. CompeteRx also supplies a generic model for non-flux events. It simply changes values of one or more parameters for market entries at a specified instant. So like a change in FDA policy. As already noted, many events in CompeteRx are predetermined. However, brand managers should be profligate in hypothesizing other events as plausible what-ifs to stress test their decision options thoroughly. Finally, drug marketing strategies in CompeteRx are represented in terms of three component decisions: pricing, marketing mix, and competitive behavior. CompeteRx captures pricing strategy via a process model, which is essentially a schedule. Each row in the schedule table specifies a new price and the simulated month at which that price takes effect. The marketing mix strategy is also modeled as a scheduled process. Only each row in this table specifies how much to increase or decrease the monthly spend allocated to each of the three channel categories: detailing, DTC, and payer discounts. The third and most novel behaviors model in CompeteRx are the adaptive dynamics for modeling market competition. So if you think about it, a brand manager is responsible for detecting significant changes in their drug market and or the position of their drug in that market. They then have to identify threats and opportunities in those changes and respond to them in order to maintain, restore, or improve their position as appropriate to their strategy. I've already noted that third-party and proprietary market intelligence is abundant. The problem here is how to translate this information into behaviors that can be simulated in test drives to help brand managers anticipate how competitor responses will influence outcomes of proposed strategies. For example, they want to avoid price wars breaking out. So CompeteRx converts this available knowledge about competitor behaviors into simple agent-based decision rules, if-then constructs. The if part of such rules consists of one or more stimuli or trigger conditions. For example, if market share declines by 15% or more over an interval of 3 months. These conditions model how brand managers are primed to take action. The then part of the rule consists of the adaptive actions they are likely to take. In CompeteRx, actions adjust a drug's marketing mix. For example, a brand manager might respond by increasing monthly spend rates in DTC ads by 20% over 2 months. Drug companies, particularly large ones, are not particularly innovative in their competitive strategies. This stability or inertia makes it possible for marketing analysts to review the historical behaviors of competitors and codify observed behaviors into these intuitive rule-based constructs for CompeteRx to exploit in simulations. The final challenge is fitting these dynamic behaviors into a coherent test drive simulation pattern. CompeteRx simulates marketing strategies over a 5-year interval. That's appropriate for the rate of change in this market. Each tick of the simulator clock represents 1 month. So at the start of each cycle, the simulation engine injects prorated chunks of annual trends and ripe events into the economy and the drug market. An event is ripe when its scheduled occurrence matches the current clock tick. Next, the simulator updates the size of the drug market and runs the regression model to update market shares for the participating drugs. Third, the simulator loops through the drug companies and the drugs currently on the market. It updates their performance values for the last cycle and then checks their pricing and marketing mix decision tables. If any rules are triggered, it updates drug prices and marketing mix spend rates as necessary. Finally, CompeteRx checks the decision rules that model brand managers' sense and respond behaviors, revising marketing mix strategies if necessary. So in essence, CompeteRx models competition using game theory. It plays what's known as an iterative game, in which brand managers adapt their strategies in response to market changes, which depend partly on prior decisions made in earlier cycles by the brand managers. So to validate CompeteRx, we conducted a test drive for a drug marketing decision based on a historical situation. This choice allowed us to compare results generated using CompeteRx against an actual decision whose outcome was already known. This test drive involved the market for gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. Acid reflux is a common mild version of GERD, so it's a pretty big market. The case study focuses on a subclass of prescription drugs for GERD called proton pump inhibitors, PPIs. Prilosec and Prevacid are PPI drugs. So in the baseline scenario, the patent for one drug expires mid-simulation. Its producer responds by pulling its original drug from the market and replacing it with a new branded substitute that had already received FDA approval. Upon patent expiry, a competitor introduces a generic version of that drug. Recall that all brand managers in this market know about the expiring patent years in advance, so they have ample time to prepare one. Our test drive model looks at 2 decision options for a brand manager from a third competing company. One choice is simply to preserve the status quo by maintaining the prior marketing mix until patent expiry and then addressing the inevitable erosion of market prices by reducing marketing spend. The brand manager's second option is to respond aggressively. This option consists of pumping up marketing spend prior to expiry and then maintaining it. So this strategy's goal is to steal share amid the market turbulence and then maintain the market share not grabbed by the generic from the remaining branded competitors. I'll briefly review some key comparative analytic outputs from test drive simulations of these two options. This time series plot shows the relative market shares for 5 drugs over a 5-year period. The pink line represents the drug owned by the brand manager decision maker when he adopts the aggressive marketing mix. So it pumps up and then it tails off. The turquoise line represents the drug whose patent expired and is taken off the market, while the blue line stands for the new branded drug that this company introduces to replace it. The green line represents the new generic drug that's introduced, while the red line depicts the 5th branded market, the drug in the PPI market, which is not a major player. And note the market volatility in the period preceding and after patent expiry for the drug in turquoise. So here's the bottom line results. These plots compare results for the 2 decision options considered by the brand manager of interest. The red lines correspond to the aggressive marketing and sales option, while green depicts the status quo option. The simulation projects the aggressive strategy clearly steals market share from the expiring drug and largely preserves that share after the generic enters the market. However, it's equally obvious that the costs to achieve those gains are equally sizable. So the metric that tells us the most is NPV, which combines net sales, essentially a proxy for market share, and total costs, which includes marketing spend. This plot reveals that the net gain achieved by the aggressive strategy is only roughly 2% of total NPV. This represents a rather mediocre marginal gain given the opportunity costs of investing tens of millions of dollars over a multi-year period. So this test drive analysis suggests that the status quo option is superior, assuming that the resources that were allocated to the aggressive strategy can be reassigned to other branded drugs that project greater NPV performance in their markets. Finally, this table depicts the detailed market and financial results for the brand manager's drug. Each column represents 1 month, and the difference performance elements are in the row. So the top grouping summarizes market level data. The rest of the table breaks down the market and financial data for an individual drug into categories of costs, margins, cash flow, and return. This standardized format is very familiar to marketing decision makers. And the results basically corresponded to what happened in the historical phase, which was several decades ago. So to summarize, the test drive method combats or bends the law of unintended consequences for critical decisions. It combines scenario planning and simulation to improve our abilities to anticipate plausible futures and project the likely outcomes of candidate decisions in those settings. The pilot example that we walked through today showcases a fairly pragmatic, experimental approach to decision making. This is sometimes called learn by doing. You try and figure out what's a good strategy by practicing your decisions and making your mistakes in a virtual rather than a real environment. It also highlights how hybrid simulations capture available knowledge about situational dynamics with greater capability and fidelity than spreadsheets or one-trick simulation tools like System Dynamics or Monte Carlo. Specifically, CompeteRx modeled changing casts of drugs and drug companies and adaptive behaviors such as competition. And finally, it demonstrates an integrated methodology that supports multiple phases of the critical decision-making process. So, take a breather, and that's the core.
Rich, I want to thank you for that incredibly comprehensive presentation. And frankly, I think it could not be more timely. You can probably stop the screen share so we can see the rest of our crew here. But
Yeah, sure.
what I'm thinking about is the State of the Union last night. Um, President Biden uh, mentioned his administration's plan of capping the prescription cost, drug cost on Medicare. And, he made 2 points. I mean, first point is that drug costs in the United States are well in excess of those internationally.
Right.
But secondly, he said, he wanted to cap the price at $8 rather than at the international average of 32, something like, I think those are the numbers I remember. But the ultimate point is, how do you think the Pfizers and Modernas and other drug manufacturers of the world are going to respond? How will are they overpricing in the United States? Is their cost different in the US than it would be in Canada or England or somewhere else?
It
And
it's significantly different. And I mean that the core argument underlying Biden and uh, uh, most advocates of this approach is that we're basically subsidizing lower prices in other countries. Okay, and because we allow the price to go up. So, for example, in any country that has a national healthcare system,
yeah,
there's a single payer,
yeah,
and the drug companies have to go through that single payer. Okay, and I'll tell you another reason. Okay, so drug companies are going to respond in a predictable manner, which is they're going to pressure Congress, and they're going to spin a story to the population, which is favors their approach, and they're going to stress innovation, right? You're going to reduce
yeah. No,
innovation,
I get that.
and third thing they're going to do is they're going to litigate until the cows come home.
Yeah, that's also the American way.
So now another point of interest, the difference between um, our situation and most other countries is we're pretty much the only country, certainly in the developed world, that allows direct-to-consumer advertising ads. Okay, and so given that that is a equal, if not greater, uh, portion of a drug company's costs, the counter argument that someone like Biden should be making is you can whack a huge amount of your operating costs out of the picture if you simply stop doing marketing ads directly to consumers.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot,
Yeah.
right? Probably not quite a third, but let's say a quarter.
Well, I guess my ultimate question is how do you think the drug manufacturers in the U.S. will respond to this um, plan on the part of the administration? I guess it is a proposal. It's yeah, obviously not in effect, but
Yeah.
how will the drug manufacturers in the U.S. respond in terms of, well, I mean, will they say, well, we just can't produce it at that price, we're no longer going to produce it? Or will they go through a risk-benefit analysis of the kind you've described and see where they can make some compromise in order to reduce the cost of their manufacture?
Yeah.
And what would
Well,
be, and finally, what would be the most responsible way for them to respond?
well,
All right, maybe you can exclude that one. That may be too deep. Yeah.
prosecution is leading the witness. um, well, it's going to be all over the map. I'll give an
Yeah.
example. In the Globe just a couple days ago, or maybe it was on Yahoo News, um, it turns out that there's a drug that's administered through inhalers,
Yeah.
and GlaxoSmithKline
Yeah.
makes that drug, and they're no longer because of this because of the current the initial round in the salvo, in the government salvo, is that Biden got a law passed that said the top 10 drugs, the prices are going to be capped.
Yeah.
And GlaxoSmithKline uh, makes this asthma drug, and it's one of the top 10. And they're basically pulling the drug off the market and passing it off to another generic, selling it to a contract manufacturer, a generic manufacturer. So
Okay.
their response is to basically walk away from the table for drugs that aren't profitable to them, no
Well,
longer profitable to them.
that sounds like a reasonable business decision as long as there's an alternative.
Well, but that's happening all over the place where people feel there's so much pressure in drug prices, we
Yeah.
can't make money on it, so we're going to stop making it.
Yeah.
So you've got a situation where the government, assuming, and this is a whopper of an assumption, assuming you could actually pass a law that such as Biden proposed, and you get it through all the lawsuits, that law would also have to include provisions which basically prevent drug manufacturers from pulling out of markets unless they can guarantee replacements. Otherwise, a lot of people are going to be injured or possibly die. So,
Well, let me take an alternative. I see a hand, and I will come to Dan in just a moment, but let me take an alternative situation. Let's suppose we go back to the question we were talking about before we began our recording today. That was the issue of steel making electrolytically. There is no doubt that you can reduce iron ore to iron electrolytically, just as you can thermally. And thermodynamics is consistent. It takes a certain amount of energy. And
mhm,
that energy there's also an electrical equivalent demand.
yeah,
So there's no doubt you can do it. The question is, it, which is the best compromise? I mean, you can produce green steel if you're doing it electrolytically,
yeah,
but on the other hand, you're increasing the demand on the grid, which is already overexposed in that sense.
yeah,
So if you were a company that was in looking at, and there is a company, Boston Metals and Don Mattingly spoke to this group about exactly this technology
yeah.
a couple of years ago. And if you were Don Sadoway and Boston Metals, what kind of analysis would you do to determine whether steel making electrolytically it has a chance of making it into the marketplace in a competitive sense? How would
Yeah.
you?
Well, you would think about the underlying technology that produces these test drives
Yeah,
as Excel on steroids, right?
yeah,
Out of the box, it's got no it's very powerful, but it's very stupid. It doesn't know anything. Okay, you have to build a model in order to analyze something, just like
yeah,
you have to build a model in a spreadsheet
yeah,
to analyze cost, benefits, or engineering. So what you
yeah,
have to do is you have to build a um, custom test drive model for that particular situation. And so then you have to worry about, well, what are the dominant dynamics in that situation, right? And so a lot of what you talked about are things that are modeled, there's certain trends going on. There are certain um, um, forces at play,
yeah,
and there are certain events. So an event might be a piece of legislation
yeah,
or a new technology discovery would be an example of a force. And what you have to do is you have to model all of those dynamics, and you have to start modeling explicitly some of the stakeholders. So you have to model, what's the government's current behavior and what might they do in
yeah.
terms of legislation, both at the state level and the federal level. And you have to model what competitors are doing,
Right. Well,
right?
I'm
And,
interested.
and so,
This is a complicated issue, but I have a proposal.
yeah,
How about if I send Don Sadoway your contact information? Because frankly, I think you might have a useful conversation with him.
uh-huh.
Would that be agreeable, or would you
Yeah,
prefer?
I'd be happy to talk to him. I mean, it takes at this point, I have not touched this code in 5 years, so it might take a considerable effort to resurrect it.
Yeah.
But I'd certainly be happy to talk to him and explain this is the way that you have to think about it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I see hands and I want to come to the hands. Dan Metley, you're first up. You have to unmute though. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Not
Not
yet.
quite.
Mm.
There you
Okay.
go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the Rich, for the presentation.
You're welcome.
It was very revealing and helpful. Let me just say a couple of things as background. I'm a social scientist by training.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm very familiar with the literature coming out of Tversky and Kahneman's work and coming out of Herb Simon's work and all of his disciples. So I have a good sense of bounded rationality and heuristics. I guess a minor point before I go on, I actually don't see them as parallel inputs, independent. In fact, I think one of the reasons why we have bounded rationality is because of heuristics and biases. So I guess conceptually I would organize this somewhat differently. But I mean, more fundamentally, I've been involved, as many of the people on this webinar know, in nuclear waste management.
Uh-huh.
And I've been involved at the secretarial level, at the Department of Energy, and at the presidential level. And so let me give an example why I am concerned that what you've presented strongly violates Herb Simon's warning about bounded rationality, because it involves all these calculations, et cetera, et cetera. And let me give an example of why bounded rationality has its real limits in at least some of the decisions I've been involved with. And that was the decision by the Department of Energy to lobby Congress to change the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act and eliminate alternative sites for a repository, to investigate alternative sites for a repository. And in 1987, Congress was influenced by DOE, who came to the decision we should eliminate everything except Yucca Mountain. And so a law was passed in 87 to do that. 13 years later, President Obama killed Yucca Mountain. Why did he kill it? And how might your modeling have prevented that? Well, it was eliminated for two reasons. Reason number one is Nevada had an early primary. Reason number two, Harry Reid was the majority leader in the Senate. So 23 years later, these events arose that, in my mind at least, were totally unpredictable, no matter how sophisticated the modeling was. And yet the failure or the inability to make those predictions, very low probability predictions, meant that the decision the Department of Energy made proved in the end to be unworkable. So I think the issue that I'm trying to suggest is bounded rationality is a much more powerful force in organizations. And moreover, those kinds of forces are very, very hard, if not impossible, to improve upon.
I totally agree with everything you said. And that's why the book is called Bend the Law of Unintended Consequences,
Yeah,
Not Break It.
yeah. I should say, after your first talk, I went out and bought the book before its price rose on Amazon. I guess several other people must have bought it as well. And I enjoyed reading it. I'm
Thank
not
you.
convinced.
Thank you very much. Well, I think I think there's a difference in expectations. So the way I marketed this technology when I was a consultant and I was peddling it in places was um, um, I um, what this does is if you apply a disciplined approach like this, you will do a better job than if you don't use this kind of approach. So no, it's you're right. I cannot anticipate black swan events, but this has a couple of advantages. Number one, it does a very good job at overcoming a lot of biases and sort of pushing back against bounded rationality as much as you can reasonably push back against it. Another thing that it does is because these are digital models, you basically have an audit trail of the decision processes that you've gone through. So number one, that allows you to say where did we go wrong and how can we make the model incrementally better. Another thing that it does is it starts putting together a library of what ifs. So once you get burned once by a certain kind of political pressure, shame on you if you don't put that into your if you don't take that into account the next time you use this system. So it's not a miracle when you use it, but if you use such methods over time, you're going to do better than you would without it.
I guess my fundamental point is the demands on an organization to try to go through the kinds of things you're suggesting really are too much, particularly when you got to act quickly. I guess I'm more of I'm more convinced of Herb Simon's arguments
Uh-huh.
about bounded rationality than you are.
Well, first of all, I agree with you. This is not the kind of tool that you would use if you need to act quickly, unless you'd already prepared some things. Secondly, since you read the book, there's a chapter which was probably of interest to you, given your background, on managing organizational change, actually enabling organizational change. So we did an entire exercise. We came into it was the naval shipyards, and they were facing, I don't know if you remember years ago, Donald Rumsfeld's revenge, when he wanted to take the Department of Defense and he wanted to change it from a union-based compensation scheme to a pay-for-performance-based scheme,
Yeah.
and which is it's basically akin to Ron's example of trying to control drug prices. The audience was not entertained and pushed back ferociously. So we were brought in, and we had a pre-existing model for managing change. And basically, we went through the initial analysis, coming up with and validating a pretty good plan in a period of about 5 days, 5 work days. So that's not much. Okay. Basically, what happens is I build the system. I usually partner with a subject matter expert. The subject matter expert is the one who, with me in the background, works with a client to get the data. And in that case, to make sure that everybody was on the same page, it was sort of like what do you call it? It was a group exercise. So 5 days is not an undue amount of time for something that's going to make or break the organization.
Yeah. Well,
Let
anyway,
me just,
I think this is very helpful. I enjoyed the conversation. I think we'll just part with different perspectives.
Okay.
yeah,
Well, I'm sympathetic to your
I would
perspective,
point
but
I just
one
want
last thing. The question is, what would you do instead to help people make better decisions?
Um, you see, I think your best hope is to start off and make sure that what you do is reversible.
Uh-huh.
And we don't do that. So, in other words, any decision that I would advocate for has to have an explicit reversibility component.
Okay.
I'm gonna suggest that, let's see, Michael, where'd you go? Are you still here?
Mm.
Oh, I'm hold on, Michael, you're muted.
I just thought that if, in the interest of time, I'd take my hand down, but I just
Go
want to
ahead.
make a point that years back when I was working in community development, my job was to help low-income individuals start businesses. This included artists, people that were already in business, etc. It's different skill levels. But my approach to them was to build the business in the computer, build the virtual business, take all the line items, all the income, all the expenses, every variable we could think of, and build a business plan month to month for the next 3 years. And that allowed us to understand what individual decisions made, the effects they made down the road. And the interesting thing about businesses is they all speak the same language, and
Uh-huh.
that language is called accounting. And if
Right.
you know how to speak that language, a business will tell you if it's sick, if it's going to be sick 6 months from now, how to prevent it from being sick, so you can tell the future if you understand the language. The issue I found was people don't like bad news. So some people came in smiling and left crying, and others came in crying and left smiling. But the important thing was that I had to be an independent observer to make sure that their biases didn't affect the variables or the decisions they were making in the spreadsheet. Because generally, entrepreneurs don't like bad news and they have blue sky mentality. So I think it's important to watch the human element so
Yeah.
that the decisions are, as you say, Richard, really valid.
Yeah. Well, one of the things this is good for is when you have competing interests in making a decision. And so I'll give you a good example.
Hmm?
Uh, a merger and acquisition, right, which is a high risk decision, 60-70% failure rate. If you remember several years ago, maybe decades ago, there was a merger between HP bought out Compaq, right? Carly Fiorina was the president of HP, and she wanted to grow by taking over Compaq. And Walter Hewlett vociferously resisted, right? So he had a model, and she had a model. And so you were like comparing apples and oranges. With a system like this, you can actually put both models into a single common framework and compare and contrast them. And you have an objective, to your point, you have an objective basis for looking at a decision. And the nice thing is every time you put a piece of an assumption into the model, you have to document it, either with a reference or why that assumption is there. So it's never the case that you have hidden or implicit information, which is also valuable when you go back and revisit that decision 10 years later and you say, well, where did that come from? Why did I assume that, or what was the assumption that led us to this juncture? So there's a lot of sort of ancillary advantages for having a framework like this, for making decisions and basically capturing a corporate archive of decision-making behavior. Usually you don't have that, right? When a CEO leaves, whatever was in his head, that's gone.
Done.
Yeah.
Well, that's not gone with this system. With this system, if you go through a bunch of what ifs, you know what that guy was or that woman was thinking about.
Rich, I wanna thank you once again for joining us.
My
I
pleasure.
think I think as I listened to the last few minutes or several minutes of conversation, it just emphasizes how important it is to engage the forces that are at work here. I mean, public forces, there are corporate forces, and there are political forces, and they're very difficult to manage collectively.
Yeah.
That's I think the bottom line for takeaway from my perspective. But I want to thank you for all, on behalf of all of us, for really giving us a good bird's eye look at all of this. Thank you very much again.
My pleasure. It was fun to do.
And I'll just remind everyone that we'll meet again in 2 weeks. John Chesto from the Boston Globe will be our speaker. And look forward to seeing you then. Take care, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye.